Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's second in our series of Road to 2015 events. My name is Jared Wesley, and I'm the Pro-Academic Chair for IPAC Edmonton. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody in person and online to this event. For those of you who may not be familiar with IPAC, we're a dynamic association of public servants from all orders of government across Canada, as well as academics and others interested in public administration. The Edmonton Regional Group of IPAC is one of 18 regional groups across Canada, and with more than 700 members, we're the second largest regional group in the country. And we feature members from folks here in provincial government, the cities of Edmonton, St. Albert, Strathcona County, County of Leduc, and others. Our goal every year is to bring together new and experienced public servants, academics, and others in our region and across Canada to promote public service innovation, foster collaboration, and recognize excellence. We do this through a variety of forums, including this Road to 2015 series, and we appreciate the support of MNP and PwC Canada, which help us to continue to provide this kind of great programming. For more information on IPAC and how to join and learn more about what we do, please visit our IPAC website at ipac.ca/Edmonton. For today's event, if you have any questions online, we'll be monitoring them on Twitter. Please use the hashtag Road to 2015, and that could be live or afterwards. I encourage our great panelists today to continue the conversation there afterwards. Speaking of this afternoon's event, we have three exceptional speakers lined up to discuss the next federal election. As I said, this is the second event in our Road to 2015 series, as we ask thought leaders from the polling, journalism, and academic sectors to join together and discuss what they expect to see in the months ahead leading up to the October 2015 election. Our first speaker, David Coletto, is CEO and founding partner of Abacus Data, a full market research and public opinion research firm based in Ottawa. David started Abacus over 4 years ago and has since grown into one of Canada's most respected market research firms. David's work focuses on Canadian public affairs and generational differences. He's advised many organizations, including the LCBO, the City of Toronto, Hudson's Bay, and the RCMP on how to manage, engage, and empower Canadian millennials. Earning a doctorate in political science from the University of Calgary in 2010, David is an adjunct professor at the Arthur Kroger College of Public Affairs at Carleton University. Our second speaker is Vassy Kapelos, Global Nationals parliamentary correspondent, and she often appears as a panelist on the West Block. She's reported on a wide variety of important political topics across Canada. In 2013, she received the Edward R. Murrow Award for Best News Series for Code Red, a series on Alberta's ambulance system crisis that forced an official provincial review. She avidly hosts and moderates panels for organizations that have included the Government Relations Institute of Canada, United Nations Association of Canada, Alberta Enterprise Group, Trudeau Foundation, and Canadian International Council. Vassy has a degree from the University of Western Ontario and an MA from Dalhousie University, both in political science. And continuing our theme of Western Ontario, we're happy to have Dr. Laura Stephenson with us, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Western. Her research interests are in the areas of political behavior in institutions and the interaction between the two. Her work has been published in many journals, including Electoral Studies, the International Journal of Public Opinion Research, Political Psychology, and the Canadian Journal of Political Science. She is also co-editor of a leading volume called Voting Behavior in Canada. She earned her PhD from Duke University. So with that introduction, I'll turn the mic over to David Coletto. David, would like to hear your thoughts on the Road to 2015.
Well, thanks so much, Jared, and it's great to be here and to share some of my thoughts. What I'm going to do, obviously, as the pollster on the panel, is to bring perspective from the data that I've seen and we've been collecting. So I'm going to share some of the data that we have here. Just want to make sure everyone can see that. Jared, is that good?
You're good, David. Thanks.
All right. So what we've got, we collect public opinion research data about every month, and what I'm going to take you through here is just a sampling of what we've been tracking for the last few months to give you some context, I think, where we are and maybe provide us some insight into where we might be going in the next few months as we head into this federal election. Here's what everybody cares the most about, although I don't necessarily think it's the most important set of numbers right now to consider, but this is our vote intention or horse race numbers. And you can see the trend line in our own numbers back from March 2014, where in the last few months, since the end of 2014, we see a much more competitive race between the Conservatives and the Liberals, to the point where it's statistically tied. The Tories have a 1-point lead in our polling, but in more recent polls that we've seen from other firms, that lead has grown somewhat. So even in the last 4 months, the Conservatives are in a much more competitive position relative to the Liberals. The New Democrat numbers have held relatively steady in our own tracking, holding around the low 20s to the mid 20s, and you can see the Greens in the bloc well back down in third. If we look at, this is from 308.com, a polling aggregator who does some work with the CBC, he takes the average of all the polls that are released over the course of 1 month and then aggregates them up, and you can see that box in the top right corner that really shows that what we're seeing in our own polling is reflected in all the polls that we've seen across the country from different firms, and that's the race has tightened substantially to the point where in the middle of the summer, or the end of the summer, the Liberals were showing almost a 10-point lead over the Conservatives. That's all but been erased to the point where in some of the, as I said, the more recent polls released last week show the Conservatives opening up a lead. If we look at these polling averages across the country, we also see some interesting regional differences and some regional battlegrounds. So British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec I highlight here because they're likely to be the ones that matter the most. In British Columbia, we see almost a three-way race between the three main parties, with the Greens doing much better in BC than in other parts of the country. This is a significant decline of support for the Conservatives compared to 2011, and a substantial increase for the Liberals, who barely got about 10% of the vote, about 12% of the vote in BC in the last election. So this is a significant boost for them. In Vote-rich Ontario, that's going to see a number of new seats added. We see a very close race with the Conservatives and the Liberals, telling that the New Democrats actually are performing least well in Ontario, the province with the most number of seats and the most number of voters, which helps to explain their low national number. And then in Quebec, what we thought was going to be a two-horse race, primarily between the Liberals and the New Democrats, in the last few weeks we've seen a number of polls from ECOS and from Forum Research that offer some evidence to suggest perhaps the Conservatives seem to be gaining in Quebec, and they argue that that's because of support for the Conservatives' anti-terrorism agenda. We'll have to see if that kind of trend holds, but it certainly adds more evidence to suggest that Quebec and that province will continue to be volatile, and it's unclear, I think, at this point where voters in that province might ultimately be going. When we look at the issues that we've been tracking, what we do is we ask voters to rank out of a list of about 14 issues. What are their top 3? These numbers here represent our most recent numbers. Healthcare, job creation, and taxes round the top 3 issues that Canadians are more likely to select. But I highlight public safety and terrorism, and I highlight that because if we look at the change that we've seen since September 2014, we've seen a 7-point increase in the percentage of Canadians who rank that issue, public safety and terrorism, in their top 3. It's not competing yet with healthcare or job creation or taxes, but it's the one issue we've seen significant change, and that's one of the things I'm going to be watching for is how many Canadians actually put that in their suite of issues that they care about. Another important trends to look for are how Canadians feel about the National Party leaders. And there are a few things to keep in mind. One is that along with rising Conservative support in terms of the horse race, we've seen a parallel rise in how Canadians, in the positive impressions that Canadians have of the Prime Minister. When you ask Canadians if they have a positive or negative impression, we see that green line trend up, particularly since September. Back in March, when sort of near the tail end or the height of the Duffy Wright affair, the Prime Minister and the government were incredibly unpopular. You can see almost half of Canadians had a negative impression of the Prime Minister. Since then, his numbers have improved. They're not net positive, as we would say. More people still view him negatively than positively, but if you're the Prime Minister right now headed into an election year, this is the kind of trend you're hoping to see. When it comes to the Leader of the Opposition, the picture is relative stability, right? Not a lot of movement in the green or red numbers, which is a good thing for Tom Mulcair. He's viewed more positively by more people than negatively, but that yellow line still is somewhat disconcerting. That's the percentage of people who say they either have a neutral impression of him or don't know enough about him. In fact, when you look at the size of the electorate that doesn't have any impression of Tom Mulcair, it's equivalent to that of Elizabeth May, and that's driven primarily of voters outside of Quebec. So Tom Mulcair's big challenge still remains. He's largely unknown and undefined outside of Quebec, which presents the New Democrats with an opportunity, but still a challenge for the Leader of the Opposition going forward. And then lastly, the big wild card of 2015 is Justin Trudeau. He's brought the Liberal Party back into contention. But you can see here that he has seen a softening of his own personal numbers, that he hit a peak in September where almost 4 out of 10 Canadians viewed him positively. Those numbers have softened to the point where they look more similar to the other two leaders, although still net positive, than he looked previously. So Trudeau mania, while it may be occurring in drips and drabs across the country. When he goes to an event, he can pull out 500 people. Across the country, though, it's not as clear that he is an incredibly popular leader, although much more popular than Stephen Harper. One of the other things we did recently, we released this last week, was a different way of looking at leadership, and we asked respondents to pick which of the 3 leaders they thought best fit into a number of different scenarios, or describe them best. And this is just a sample of what we found, but while on the one hand a fairly fun poll, it also showed us some insights into where the election might go depending on the context and the environment. So we asked, for example, which of the 3 would you most likely want to negotiate a contract on your behalf? So here you've got the Prime Minister and Mr. Mulcair fairly close in the report. In the results, Justin Trudeau in 3rd. When it comes to, for example, choosing the best movie to watch, these are the type of issues, whether it's this one here, or who do you want to have over for dinner, who do you want to invite to speak to your neighborhood, Justin Trudeau does very well, easily outpacing both the Leader of the New Democrats and the Prime Minister. But on 2 other important questions, and you can see that the juxtaposition between the Prime Minister's character and how Canadians view him, even if they don't like him, versus that of his, right now, his primary competitor, Justin Trudeau. On questions of who'd make the best CEO, on who has the best ideas to invest your money, the Prime Minister easily beats Justin Trudeau on those 2 measures. So on the one hand, people like Justin Trudeau. They see him as a breath of fresh air, a change, somebody that they want to be around, and that's in sharp contrast to the Prime Minister, who has none of those virtues or values. But on the other hand, you can see that the Prime Minister does well on the things that you often ascribe to a Prime Minister or a leader in times of crisis or in more difficult times, which is why the environment is particularly important. And speaking of the environment, the economy is obviously an important part of the next campaign. The Conservatives want it to be part of the discussion. The Liberals and New Democrats also want the economy to play large. And in our tracking, for the first time in a long time, we've noticed some growing anxiety about the state of the economy. No doubt a result of the declining price of oil. Although consumers feel good about cheaper gas, they recognize that it's going to have an impact on certain regions of the country. But also the fact that the Bank of Canada reduced interest rates is a signal to voters and to the public that things might not be as good as we once thought. So you see a 10-point drop in the percentage of Canadians who describe the economy as doing well or very good or good. 10-point increase in those who say poor, and more disconcerting is the prospective evaluation, that for the first time more people say that in the next 6 months the economy is going to get worse than it's going to get better. So we describe this as a growing anxiety. The sky is not falling. Canadians aren't overly pessimistic or worried about the economy, but this growing anxiety, that the chance that things may not be as good as we thought, creates opportunities and challenges, I think, for the 3 main parties. The last point I'm going to bring up before I hand it off to my co-panelists is a question that I think is actually far more important this far out from an election, and that's, who do Canadians think will win the election in October? And here's where you see an important trend line. If you go back to August 2014, there was a 14-point gap in the percentage of Canadians who thought the Liberals would win compared to the Conservatives. Since then, that gap has all but erased, similar to the gap closing in terms of vote intention, but a much more severe closing. To the point now where equal numbers of Canadians think that the Liberals or the Liberals or the Conservatives are going to win the election. One final point on this is that New Democrat line at the bottom. The Leader of the Opposition, the government so-called in waiting, less than 10% think that the NDP is going to win the next election. That presents a challenge for Tom Mulcair, particularly in an environment where the Liberal leader is far more popular than the previous Liberal leader, where the Liberals look to be the clear alternative. The only upshot or upside for the New Democrats is that if you ask this question just prior to the start of the 2011 election campaign, we probably see similar numbers. So things can change very quickly, and it doesn't mean the NDP can't win, but at least in the expectations of Canadians, they don't see the NDP as being that government in waiting. So the things that I'm looking for going forward, particularly from a public opinion point of view, is, again, following that last slide I showed you, who do Canadians think will win the election? I think there's going to be a lot of potential for some strategic voting in some regions of the country. We've seen some data that we've done in Quebec that suggests, although Tom Mulcair is the most popular leader, the leader that they see most closely aligns with Quebec values and will defend Quebec's interests, when you ask people who's best to beat Stephen Harper, best able to beat Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau comes ahead. So that's an important question. Secondly, does anxiety about the economy and security continue to rise going forward? I think this plays well into the Conservatives' strategy. They were thinking that they might have to run a campaign on a strong economy, everything going well, but when a campaign is going to likely be centered around the leadership, and the question of whether Stephen Harper deserves another 4 years, or is Justin Trudeau perhaps ready to be Prime Minister, or is Tom Mulcair the alternative? The mood of the public and the feelings that perhaps their personal security as well as their financial security might be at risk raises the stakes for a leader who they may think they know well, but doesn't, in Justin Trudeau, but may not understand how he might perform in office. And then lastly, I think this is particularly important. The Prime Minister's personal numbers improved following the attacks here in Ottawa and in Quebec, I think in part because his tone changed. He was not as partisan as he might have been before, and that I think had positive effects. We saw a Prime Minister who was much more prime ministerial than perhaps we often see in the House of Commons. The question I have is, will they learn from that experience, position the Prime Minister and in a way that's not as partisan, as mean-spirited as he's sometimes perceived to be, and as more that statesman that we might be looking for in these difficult times. So that is my quick synopsis of the polling data, and I will hand things over to the next panel. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Insightful as always from Abacus Data. You guys are at the cutting edge of public opinion, and we really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through some of those numbers and identified a number of opportunities and challenges for all of these, for all of the parties moving forward. So with that, we'll turn the floor over to Vassy Kapelos.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks, David, for your presentation. I'm just going to bring up mine. Mine does not have as many numbers because I'm a reporter, so I can't do math. Can everyone see that okay?
Looks great on our end. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think that it's going to be a very bumpy road to 2015, which is exciting as a reporter to cover. And I picked 3 basic areas, although I think there's a huge myriad. And there's kind of a lot of overlay with what David said, but hopefully some different perspective just based on being here in the bubble and going to QP every day and sort of seeing how a lot of these issues are playing out in the House of Commons and between politicians. So the first thing I'll be looking at is ISIS. Like David mentioned, in no way is this meaning to negate the seriousness of what happened, but obviously the attacks here in October and subsequent attacks around the world have had an impact on the political scene here in Ottawa and on sort of how people are perceiving various leaders. I know for myself, I remember right after the attacks talking to a couple friends in Toronto who are diehard liberals, who kind of said to me surprisingly, oh, thank goodness it was Harper in charge and not Trudeau wasn't there. So I think it has really permeated political discourse here, and we've seen things get really, really heated and interesting. And just to the point David made about whether the Prime Minister takes sort of stayed with that tone right after the attacks. This is a clip I pulled from a few weeks ago when a lot of questioning was going on between the opposition and the Prime Minister over what exactly the mission in Iraq is, and I'll just play that.
Mr. Speaker, I know the NDP is against that. I know the opposition thinks it's a terrible thing that we're actually standing up to jihadists. I know they think it's a terrible thing that some of these jihadists got killed when they fired on the Canadian military. I don't know what other militaries are doing, but I know that ours are doing exactly what this Parliament has to do, and the Canadians are behind it. Mr. Speaker.
So I played that clip because this was sort of a turning point here in Ottawa. The question I put is, if you're not with us, you like terrorists. So that's obviously a play on what was said, but I think it'll be interesting to see if that either continues to bolster the Prime Minister's numbers, just this idea of terrorism being such a big issue, or if the discourse keeps continuing the way that it is, kind of elevating and has become, then will that impact negatively on him and perhaps positively on the opposition, to be seen. I also have a question here about the expanded mission and how that might impact things going forward. Obviously, in the next month and a half, April 7th, this mission is up. All signs are pointing to it being an extended mission, but the question is whether it will be expanded. Are we going to be looking at ground combat, and if so, how will that impact the election, and sort of how Canadians perceive security and how important security is to them going forward? And then the third thing I have is more attacks, and I don't mean this in a crude way, but as pointed out, the Prime Minister's numbers did jump after the attacks here in Ottawa, and if there are other attacks and the timing of those attacks, it will also, I think, influence how important security is to Canadians when they head to the polls. So the second subject I have is the economy. My first question is, if it sucks, who benefits? And I ask that because I think that obviously, from those numbers we see, people are growing, or Canadians are growing increasingly concerned about the state of the economy. We've seen another number of revisions, about GDP growth next year and this year even. The dollar is a worry for some and a benefit to others. But I think that, in the last election and since then, the Conservatives have positioned themselves pretty successfully as the best steward or the best manager of the economy. So if the economy isn't doing well, I wonder, does that, positively affect them in that people will think, oh, these guys are the only ones that can bring us out from the doldrums again? Or will it, if they took all the glory and the credit, will they also have to take the fall with the economy? I don't know the answer to it, but it's something I'll be watching. The second question I have is, what the hell is the middle class? And that's because I'm sure you guys hear in stops that the politicians make, but all the time in Ottawa, I hear the middle class, we're going to save the middle class. Every party says it all the time. I don't really know what it means, and I don't know if Canadians do. So I think that if a party can successfully articulate what they mean by that and exactly what they're going to do, and Canadians can understand it, then maybe they'll be successful. But in the meantime, it just seems to occupy a whole lot of the debate here and a whole lot of election talk, and I don't know if anyone's really clear on exactly what anyone's going to do to help all of us in the middle class. And the third thing I have is, will promises slip away with the price of oil? So obviously the price of oil has different impacts on the economy, but we saw that in November there was a number of promises made based on a certain idea of what the surplus will be, of course heading into an election year. So given the price of oil and the sort of unknown effect right now on that surplus, and whether or not they're going to use the contingency fund, I think it'll be interesting to see what promises they're able to keep and or make as we head closer to an election, based on these newly sort of revised numbers and the revised and continually changing impact on the country's bottom line. And then the last thing I have here is Quebec. I have a saying, tout est bien qui finit bien, so all's well that ends well. My question is, for who? Obviously, Quebec, I think will be one of the most important provinces to watch. We know that it's a close race there. Those numbers from David were super interesting, especially where the Conservatives are concerned. We all sort of envision this, epic battle between the Conservatives and, the Liberals and the NDP. I think that the Liberals, obviously need to change the trajectory there, and they need to win a number of seats there in order to get to at least attain some kind of minority. And I just think Quebec is so unpredictable. The politics there are so interesting. Obviously, with what happened with the NDP 4 years ago, it was so fascinating, and I think that it has the potential to do the same this time around. But I also ask, who could forget the center of the universe? And as a Torontonian, I can say that. I think Ontario will also be very important, and I think the interest over the provincial election and how they voted, along with the municipal election, sort of everyone is wondering 905 versus 416. 905 especially seems to be shaping up as a battleground. I think those will be really interesting ridings to watch, and and sort of sentiment to try and figure out. Obviously I don't know what will happen, but that's another area I'll be paying attention to. And then my last one is, and no offense meant, do polls and the media suck? And this sort of goes along with the battle in Quebec, the battle in Ontario. I think having lived through and reported on the Alberta election, I'll be really watching my own interpretation and other media interpretation of polls. I'm not saying polls were wrong. I actually don't think they were that wrong in the Alberta election, which I can explain more if asked. But I think that it's the way that we interpret them and present them to Canadians. So I'll be looking to see if we're cognizant of sort of how they measure a certain sentiment at a certain point in time, but not to use them to sort of make this crazy three-way horse race and make it sort of what I know that a lot of us want to report on. So I'll be watching that, and I'll be watching how other people interpret them and how they're presented. And that's it.
Great, thanks, Vassy. And I saw David biting his lip. I'm sure he's ready to talk about pollsters and responsibility. But I think it is a joint responsibility, as you said, between media and the polling community to make sure that we get it right. And thanks for sharing your perspective. It's always interesting for us to see what the watchers are watching, and we look forward to seeing you more in the months ahead on Global. I'm going to turn it over now to Laura Stephenson.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I've really enjoyed those two presentations, so thank you, David and Vassy. So I don't have a presentation for everyone. You're stuck looking at me for a little bit, but I just wanted to share my thoughts about what I'm kind of paying attention to as we head towards the election. And I guess the first and foremost thing in my mind is always the timing of the election. I mean, it's scheduled for October. I'm very hopeful it stays that way. I've got a lot of surveys to write before then. But in the meantime, the timing of events that have been occurring are kind of interesting to think about as well. And certainly Baird's resignation last week raises questions about whether there will be a by-election called in his riding. Is there something we don't know been discussed or going on? So over the last, let's say, 6 months, I've heard lots of interesting rumblings about, oh, we hear it's going to be an early election, it's coming, it's coming. Just to pay attention, I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to what the parties do and what they're saying to see if there's any hint of some taking advantage of any timing that would come forward. But the biggest thing that I'm trying to pay attention to and focus on is really how the parties are going to frame themselves for the voters. And I think this is a big thing, and the numbers that David showed about the leaders, I think, are very, very telling, because you've got clear ideas about Harper pretty much across the country. It looks like people are fairly stable in how they're seeing Mulcair, and then you've got Trudeau. And what's very telling is those numbers were all coming together at that last point. And I think that means that there's a lot of room for how these parties are going to try and frame the election for voters. How are they going to frame their own party? This is very important. So are they going to try to be the party of the middle class, which they all seem to want to be, and I agree that it's kind of a curious actuality. What is it in reality? But what are they going to frame their own party as wanting to do, as trying to do? And this also means looking to see whether any groups are being targeted in particular. I think that can make a really big difference. And the parties, though, in choosing a group to target, necessarily aren't targeting somebody else. And so, these are the choices that the party strategists are going to be making. And I always like to sit back and just kind of watch how the pieces fall together, because it means they're trying to target those kinds of voters, and that they think there's a potential to get enough votes from those types of voters in order to achieve their goals. So I'll be paying attention to any kinds of promises, or seeing where the parties make their announcements, anything that looks like they're trying to target certain groups over others. That being said, I think it's also about how the parties are going to try to shape the opinions about their opponents. And so this is particularly interesting. The Conservatives have been really good at this in the past, right? They certainly were very successful, I would say, in how they characterized Ignatieff for the voting public. I think they've tried to do the same thing with Trudeau, and I don't think it's been nearly as successful for, I think, several different reasons. But how they move forward, how are they going to try to shape the issue or the choices for Canadians? And I think this is key, because the Conservatives are sitting in a position, and the numbers show it, where they're not the most hated by far, right? They're not the most popular, but a good proportion of the population is still thinking that they're a good party to govern, and they're supporting of them. And so the Conservatives are a situation where they're the known quantity, and they have to really figure out how are they going to grow their support from what it is right now in order to keep a majority, if at all possible, and to be successful. In order to do that, I think they need to turn to their communication strategies, and they need to figure out how to shape that choice. It's Harper, the man you know, the man you think you can take a lot of advice from, right, on your taxes or your finances or your job prospects. I mean, I found that poll very interesting when it was released last week and I was reading it. So you know who Harper is, you know what he's going to do. He's made his promises. That's been a very, I think, successful communication strategy for the party over the last couple of elections. On the other hand, what are the options, right? What is Mulcair? How do the Conservatives perceive Mulcair, and how do they want voters to perceive Mulcair? I think that's important, because especially in Quebec, we know, I agree with Vassy that I think Quebec is a very important area to watch. Who knows what's going to happen? I agree that I think it has the potential to do something dramatic. So how Mulcair is doing in Quebec is very important. How Harper does in Quebec is very important. And how Harper is shaping up those choices for voters is very important. And then finally, how are they going to show the Liberals, right? And I don't think the Conservatives are the only ones who've been trying to suggest to voters that, Trudeau's just not ready. And the numbers that David was showing would also indicate that he's a great guy, but not so sure about having him lead the country, seems to be a lot of the impression. And so it's going to be interesting to see what the Conservatives do to try and shape that, or trying to encourage that. Now, on the opposite end, though, I'm very interested to see what the Liberals do. And I mean, the misstep last fall with the I guess it was Ladies' Night with Trudeau, I think it was called. I don't remember the exact name of it, which that was put forward as a fundraiser, right? And it was marketed as a time for ladies to come and meet Trudeau and ask questions. I think was a big misstep. And so the party is going to need to be careful about how they shape the choices on their part. So the Liberal Party this time, right? I think the Conservative strategy is fairly clear. I want to see what they do with it. But the Liberal strategy is very different, because on the one hand, I think they want Trudeau to still be Trudeau, as in like that name, right? That name, that person, the familiarity, the someone that you really think you like or you'd hang out with. At the same time, they've got to figure out a way to make him seem like a prime minister, like somebody that they're going to trust. And so they are going to have to make some choices to try and get to that point, because especially with the way the polls are looking right now, any of the shine that seemed to be there before appears to have worn off. So they are going to have to make a real effort now to stake their own claim to what would voters be voting for? What are they choosing if they choose to go with the Liberals, right? Can they trust that Trudeau has a solid handle on his party? Can they trust that he knows what he's doing going forward? And I think a big part of this will be about the team that he assembles behind him. Because, he's not the one with the most experience in that party. And so who else he has standing with him, I think, can make a very big difference. I also think, and certainly the last couple of Ontario elections have shown this, that the events that happen right around an election time really can have a vast influence on what goes on. And we can't forget that come April, we'll be watching the news very closely again, because we'll be able to see Mike Duffy's trial coming forward, right? And again, David's numbers were really helpful here, right? Because if you look at when the Conservatives weren't doing that well, that was when it was happening. And this, I don't know, is it a gift from the gods to Trudeau? I'm not sure, but the timing of that election is very interesting. And if Duffy stays true to form, it'll be fascinating TV. And what will that mean for the Conservatives, right? They're also they've put off their budget. So I think there's a bunch of events that are going to be occurring that we really need to pay attention to. And similar to the what Vassy was saying about the issues surrounding ISIS and how is Harper dealing with it, things happen, and not by design, right? Things happen, and then when we watch how the parties deal with them, that can have a real big effect on how voters see the parties, how they understand their abilities, how comfortable they feel with them, etc. So I think that, you know, I'm looking to see what the parties do as we head into the election, and I'm also very interested to pay attention to events that I know are happening and things that are going to be coming up. The last thing I just want to mention is this is going to be an interesting election because the Conservatives did, you know, very well. They got that majority government in 2011, and I've heard the party described as, you know, a winning machine, right? It was just a party put together to win power, and they did. So what is going to happen when that power is threatened, right? So the numbers right now look like a Conservative minority. Who knows what shifts are going to occur? But not just for the Conservatives, but what are these parties willing to do to get elected, right? I mean, the scandals that have plagued the Conservatives over the various elections, I think they're important to think about because the individuals surrounding that group wanted to win power, right? So that led to things like the In-N-Out scandal or the robocall scandal. But, you know, the announcement yesterday about Eve Adams raises some interesting questions. You know, is Sudas going to be helping the Liberals? Is this something the Liberals have chosen to do? They think this is the way to win power. Are they going to choose to play the game differently? Are they going to try to change their tactics? What are these parties willing to do? And what are their supporters willing to do? I mean, this is probably even more important to get to this point of power. And so I think this is very important because I believe in electoral democracy, and I think that it's you know, not something that we can ignore or just wipe away. And our election laws are important, and so how the parties treat those laws and, you know, how those involved choose to campaign is something that we should all pay attention to. So that's it for me.
Great, thanks, Laura. And you raise a very interesting point. Oftentimes we focus on how it is that people come to formulate their decisions, or we focus on what the outcomes were from a voter's perspective, but it's just as often important to focus on the choices that parties allow them to make. In other words, how their campaigns can help to structure that kind of decision. Thank you very much to all three of our panelists. We now have some time for question and answer. Remind folks online to use the hashtag #RoadTo2015 to ask questions, and I'll actually pull the first question from @SylvesterLaw, who asks, in the U.S., the Democrats and Republicans target different groups of undecided voters. What about Canada? Do Conservatives and Liberals target different undecideds? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
Here, I can provide some perspective on sort of who's undecided and one way to view the electorate. So first off, you know, we asked the question, who would you vote for, and quite a number, about 1 out of 5 Canadians say they're undecided. They don't have a preference at this point, and that typically includes some people who won't vote. They don't want to admit it right out, so they'll say they're undecided. But we do see higher undecided among women in particular, which I think is going to be an important voting group if you can put that big group together as one in the upcoming election. Younger people are generally more likely to be undecided. They're also less likely to vote. So those are some from the undecided point. But what I think, and the way I think you should view the 2015 election, the way the electorate is structured, is not as one voting group, but in fact almost 3. And the way to look at it is we ask a question that says, would you consider voting for the Liberal Party? Would you consider voting for the Conservatives? Would you consider voting for the NDP? And if you take the responses to those questions, you actually get 3 distinct, I'll call them ecosystems, right? So you've got about half of the country that says, yeah, I'd consider voting Conservative. They've got the largest group of people who would consider none of the other parties. So they do have the largest base, but they also have the smallest group in which to grow. So those that would consider voting Conservative but aren't yet voting Conservative. They've got to convert far more of those who would consider voting for the Conservatives. On the other side, you have the New Democrats who, for the most part, have a sizable base right now, and that's driven primarily because of the success they've had in Quebec and holding on to a lot of that support at this point. But it's also, they also are competing pretty heavily with those who would consider voting Liberal. So these are the progressive center-left voters. They're the largest group in the electorate, and therefore are quite important. And so they're trying to frame their issues and fighting for those voters. Then you've got the Liberals, who we sometimes will say they're the natural centrist party. And you look at the electorate, and it is true that they're actually competing. They've got the smallest core, those who would say, I'm only going to vote Liberal or consider voting Liberal, and they're fighting with both those that would consider conservative and Liberal and those that would consider New Democrat and Liberal. And so the challenge for Justin Trudeau and most centrist parties in most democracies, except for Canada, for whatever reason, they are able to deal with this quite effectively, is how do you position yourself and appeal to both sets of voters? And I think what we're seeing from the Conservatives, and where all this talk about security and the economy play well with the Conservatives, is it speaks naturally to that center-right, conservative, liberal voter, who in 2011, I think a lot of them actually were afraid of Jack Layton and went and voted Conservative, which gave the Tories their majority. That was, I think, partly what gave the Conservatives their majority government. There's no natural Conservative majority in the country. And so the same could be true if the Conservatives can make the same claim that somehow Justin Trudeau is a big risk. And that's, I think, if you look at the electorate that way, voters are, I think, are behaving and targeting those voters based on those kinds of characteristics.
Fascinating, David. Laura and Vassy?
Yeah, I would just jump in. I think there's a couple sort of specific examples of a party, for example, the Liberals. I would pick first off trying to appeal to different sets of voters. So yesterday, for example, the Eve Adams moving over to the Liberals, some of the rhetoric Justin Trudeau used. He's trying to say things like, we're a party for all Canadians, and if you don't want to have divisive politics and you don't want to, for example, the income splitting example Eve Adams brought up a lot, then, we're the party for you. I think it was a very concerted message or concerted effort to send that message out. On the other hand, there's some decisions that you kind of shrug at and go, okay, who are you appealing to, or who are you trying to bring over? For example, the Liberals not voting in favor of the mission, the ISIS mission. I think that had, you don't even know what base they're going for or who they're trying to bring in there. Are you trying to bring in people who would vote NDP? Because it doesn't in that instance at least seem to be working, and you kind of anger perhaps some people who would naturally vote conservative in that instance. So you can tell that obviously, like David said, they're the party who naturally goes just to sort of spread their wings and bring some other people under the tent, but it's not necessarily the most straight line of a process for them, at least from what I've seen over here.
Okay. Laura?
I would agree with what's being said, and I think it's very important to remember what David's point was about the room to grow. And when there's parties that you might potentially vote for, that's very important, because then they're of course arguing over the same types of peoples. And so I'd agree with Vassy. Some of the positions that these parties take make me scratch my head. I can't make sense of. On the other hand, I think we might be seeing that the Liberals are going to try and stake out that red Tory ground a little bit more closely, and I would expect that they're going to try to position themselves slightly to the right on the economic issues and clearly to the left on the social issues, because I think that's where they've been in the past, and I think that's probably the way that they're going to divide up their attentions. But I want to raise one other point, which is the strategic positionings and the strategic messaging that is potentially can occur. Because we did see in the past the ABC movement, we have seen that there is a pretty clear differentiation between left and right, even though the Liberals are mostly in the center. I think we see that they fight for the same people as the NDP, right? And so it's going to be a matter of what kind of messaging occurs, and the parties obviously aren't merging at this point, but what's going to be going on with their supporters, and what kind of messaging are we going to be hearing? And are the NDP numbers going to stay low? Seeing them across the country is interesting because it doesn't look like low overall, right? I mean, there's different pockets here and there. And so how are these parties going to really work with each other, or are they going to work with each other, or are they going to split the vote on the left? And we know from the past that splitting the vote can lead to a lot of power for a single party for a long time.
Thanks, Laura. Just going back to Twitter for another question from KMACD11, who wants to know, with Prime Minister Harper losing some very close people from his inner circle, Baird, for example, do you see that concerning voters at all? Not all at once. Is it likely to impact the outcome of the election? Okay, now all three at once. We'll start with Vassy.
Okay. I think that's a really interesting question, and I think timing is important here. I think Laura was making that point about how lots of things don't happen by design, and the timing of them is really important. I think in this case, that's important as well. You know, it's not a great story for Harper that someone so close to him as Baird quits. He quickly, obviously, had the cabinet shuffle just yesterday to sort of, you know, stop that conversation. I don't know if it has a lot of traction beyond people who are really interested in politics. I think it depends on how the Prime Minister reacts to it and how seamless things happen after that. But I think there are a lot of other things that you know, reflect more so on the Prime Minister to Canadians outside of Ottawa or outside of, you know, all of us political watchers who think it's severely significant. I think, though, if you do see more of them leaving, and this narrative continues to develop about, you know, now there's more than 20 MPs who aren't running, and we see more significant people quitting closer to the election, then that could have more of an impact. But at this point, I think it's something that people can get over, and that people aren't necessarily paying a huge amount of attention to.
Okay, Laura, you had a point to add?
Yeah, I would agree with that perspective. I mean, not everyone knows who John Baird is, as hard as that might be to believe, I guess, for some. But I do think that the bigger implication for me is actually in terms of the party itself. I mean, Harper's been in power for a really, really long time. So seeing all these dynamics that go on and who stays and who doesn't stay, I think that has interesting implications longer down the road. It is very important, though, that Harper not be seen as the party in its entirety. And so it's going to make a difference how he chooses to campaign with the other candidates and with the other MPs, and what kind of a team perspective he puts forward, because he himself is not the most popular person in the country. I'm not saying everybody else is either, but as a Conservative team that can manage the economy for you and take you forward and, you know, bring back the strong surplus that they were projecting, I think that would be very successful. So as he doesn't have those people to work with him, I mean, with the passing of Flaherty, it was a huge blow, right, to the party, and not having Baird around is a face that people were getting used to seeing, but that was part of his team. And so seeing how he builds his team and whether or not he's going to be taking steps to kind of give more prominence to some of the people who would be important team members moving forward will be something to look at.
Jared, if I could just add one point, I'm going to disagree slightly with what Laura said, only because I don't think the Conservatives are looking for team. I think everything that's happened in the last 9 years has been about Harper, and it's Harper's team, and it's Harper's government, and it's Harper's country, right? So I actually think they are going to, like, it doesn't hurt, the Baird resignation hurts maybe here locally in Ottawa and is riding, it maybe puts an opinion into play, and that's a local consideration. What I think, and the reason I don't think it matters too much is because the Conservatives want this to be an election where it's Stephen Harper versus Justin Trudeau. Trudeau is trying to build the team around him to downplay maybe some of his weaknesses. For Harper, it's all about him and how he, as a leader, contrasts, and his capabilities contrast with Trudeau. So, yeah, yes, it's probably not great from a governance point of view. It's probably not great from having strength in cabinet and those that are competent to manage tough files. But from a purely electoral point of view, I actually don't believe many Canadians can even name John Baird or know what position he was in. So I don't think after, you know, as we head into October, if that's when the election's going to be, that it's going to have any impact on the Tories' numbers.
Okay, and we have a live question here from in the room.
Can they hear me? Okay. One of the panelists mentioned the economy in terms of promises, which arguably can also win and lose elections as much as the events, issues, or platforms. What kind of promises do you think are possible with, you know, $50 barrel for oil prices, and Are we going to see more ideology, or do you think we're going to see more pet projects come out in the year to come?
And not all at once, everybody.
I'll figure it out. Oh.
We'll go with Vassy, yeah.
Oh, Vassy, I can go? Oh, hello?
Yeah, you can go, Vassy, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think I brought that up just because it's just been a topic here in Ottawa, given that I remember going to the press or reporting on at least the initial promises that were made, the initial tax breaks that were made, and now there are questions, did they put the cart before the horse? Were they promising money and tax breaks using money that they didn't have? And I think that there will be some kind of an impact. I don't know. I'm obviously not an economist. I can't predict where oil will go or how long it will stay low. But it seems at this point to already have had an impact. And I think that if they have to use that contingency fund to keep making promises come election time, they're going to face a lot of criticism for that. So I feel as though that might lend itself towards a more, more ideology or more discussion of ideology, because there won't be that much money left to make promises with. But things could turn around, and I could be completely wrong, come October.
Yeah, Dave?
I think what's interesting, and whether or not they meant to do this, I think the Tories have set a fairly effective trap for the other two parties, and you can see it in the way that, and Vassy mentioned this when she talked about, Eve Adams and Trudeau yesterday talking always about the tax, the income splitting, and how that's harmful for lower and middle class families. It's because they know that the Conservatives are going to basically say, there's no money left, the cupboard's bare, oil prices have dropped, we've got nothing left, and so for whatever platform options, spending promises that the New Democrats or the Liberals offer, they're basically going to say, the Liberals are going to raise your taxes, the New Democrats are going to raise your taxes, and look, here's an example. They've already said they're raising their taxes. They're running on that platform. So if they're going to raise one tax, what's to say they're not going to raise the HST or the GST or your income tax? And I think that's another area, when you think of those voter groups, right, and you think of suburban voters who already feel they pay way too much tax, that's an effective issue positioning for the Conservatives. That's something they win on, and it's hard to run against. Why you're going to overturn a Conservative income tax fund. Explaining that in 15 seconds is very difficult. Explaining why you cut taxes is very easy. So I think that the Conservatives again have found, whether they chose to do this or not strategically, I think they've set a good trap from for the Liberals to fall into, because now the Liberals have to run, and they've clearly decided they're doing this to run on a tax increase, which we'll see how that goes. But I think the economy has created that opportunity for the Conservatives.
If I can jump in?
Absolutely, Laura, yeah.
Okay, so it's an interesting way of putting it that way, David, but I think what's interesting is that talking about income splitting is, yes, it would be increasing a tax on that end, but at the same time, they're taking a very ideological position about it. And I think the bigger danger is whether or not the Conservatives are actually going to be able to have any kind of a surplus. And this is not in their hands anymore. Maybe they did put the cart before the horse with their promises, but at this point, we just have to see kind of what's happening with the economy. We already knew that they had been spending, and they had chosen to make some spending choices, and they're very targeted spending choices. I mean, come July, I'm going to get a check for having my children in July. How did that happen when the actual policy change was January, right? I mean, they made some very strategic choices, and I think that those choices on their part were very targeted, and the other parties have come out clearly against income splitting. I'm not sure that's going to hurt them quite the way you're indicating, because, again, trying to get that idea of what the middle class wants or lower income Canadians, I mean, they're going to have to be looking for that. And I do think the bigger danger is that the Conservatives don't have a balanced budget. If they even just try to meet their commitments that they've made already, and now they don't have any kind of a surplus, I think that's a huge loss for them and what they were going to be able to campaign on.
Okay, we have time for one last question. I'm going to go to Twitter for it. @Denny_Brett asks, will will voter fatigue in Alberta impact election results with a possible provincial election? Does it change where the Conservatives, Liberals, and NDP will prioritize? And if I could just take it a step up a little bit broader than that, 2015-16 is likely to feature up to 8 or 9 provincial territorial elections within a matter of 6 to 8 months. Does this affect the, I know we all suspect it will affect the provincial elections, but does it affect the federal election in any way?
Hello?
Hi, Vassy. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just jump in on the Alberta. I don't think in Alberta it will. I think that Alberta is pretty safe for the Conservatives, and I can't even envision a scenario at this point in which that won't be the case. So I don't think that voter fatigue in Alberta will be impacted. That's my honest opinion, having worked there. And I think that, I'm not sure, otherwise maybe. I think it depends on the timing of those elections, and it depends on also this election and how close it is perceived to be. I know there are a lot of different factors that go into what drives a person to actually vote or what makes them stay at home. And I think voter fatigue would only be one of those factors, and I think even within voter fatigue there are a number of variants that that will impact it. So for Alberta, no, and otherwise I think to be determined.
Thanks, Vassy. David?
I would just say I don't think it will, only because it, you know, to the detriment of those in provincial governments or municipal governments. You know, the federal election is sort of the higher order election. We typically see higher turnout there to begin with. There's going to be a lot of interest. We already see the amount of interest in terms of this. You know, if you ask Vassy and journalists, the amount of stories that they're producing and the interest that it's driving, I think will overshadow any fatigue that could be created by having a provincial election in the same few months as the federal one. So I don't anticipating it having much impact on turnout, as well as actual outcome, because I think if a new party or new government's elected in a particular province that has some connection with a federal cousin, it will take time before that government gets unpopular enough to have an impact on the federal scene. So I don't think it will, unless something earth-shattering happens that's outside of the expected.
I would agree. I'm not too concerned about that.
Well, thank you very much to all three of you for joining us here today. It's been a fascinating discussion, full of a lot of debate and a lot of interesting points that were raised. We got a lot of things to look for on the road to 2015, so thank you for sharing those. For folks that are interested in this series, want to tune in, we're organizing our next one around March 27th, but stay tuned to our website, ipac.ca/Edmonton. You can follow us on Twitter at IPAC Impact. And we'll provide all kinds of information about what to expect on the next set of events. So thanks again for joining us, everyone, and have a great rest of your 2015.